Do you see what I meant yesterday where the lands were disputed? Can you see what lands the English claimed, what lands the French claimed, and this kind of this red and blue area is what we call the undisputed areas. These are areas that really caused the conflict of who owned those particular parts of the colonies, etc. So we'll kind of go from there. So we're at our next subtopic, which is the first clash in America. Okay? So it was, like I mentioned, it was in 1754 that this decisive struggle between the British and the French broke out. And what do I mean by decisive struggle, Chantel? It's a decisive struggle.
So
it's going to decide once and for all who's going to have that land basically east of the Mississippi River. Is it going to be French or British possession? So it's a decisive struggle. It's a struggle that's going to make the decision. Now, this French and Indian War happens on land west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, the Appalachian Mountains are this mountain range that comes right through here that kind of separates the 13 colonies from this area. So all the fighting is going to be done west of the Appalachian Mountains. West. Okay, all the fighting in the French and Indian War will happen west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, this had to start somehow, right? I mean, there's tensions, but something had to spark it. It was actually wealthy Virginians that started this conflict that we're going to know as the French and Indian War. And I'll tell you how that happened. So wealthy Virginians, or wealthy colonists from Virginia, were actually the cause of this series of events that led to what we know as the French and Indian War. Now you can look at probably either map, but the other map you might want to have in front of you also, so we can kind of get an idea what we're doing. What happened is that wealthy colonists from Virginia formed a company and they secured a large land grant from the King of England. Wealthy colonists from Virginia formed a company, which is common. We've talked about that before, right? Like the Virginia Company of London, right? Well, they formed a company and they secured a large land grant from the King of England. Now, guess where this land grant was? It obviously wasn't in the area of the 13 colonies, was it? Or we wouldn't be having a dispute, would we? It was in the Ohio River Valley. Yeah. And you can, in the upper river valley. If you look on your map, either one, you can find the Ohio River for sure. On the one map, the first one I gave you yesterday has the Ohio River, and obviously the area around the Ohio River becomes the Ohio River Valley. So that's where that land grant was secured. Well, is that within the 13 colony boundaries, really? No, it's not. Well, what were these wealthy colonists going to do with this land? They were going to divide this land into small farms, and they were going to sell it to settlers to make a profit. That was the idea behind this whole thing. So these wealthy Virginians formed a company and secured a charter basically for a large land grant in the Ohio River Valley. And they were going to take this large amount of land and they were going to split it up, subdivide it, it's the common term for it. Then they were going to they were going to sell these small farms to these settlers that were coming westward for a profit, make some money. That was the idea. Why would that cause a problem? Because it was disputed land. The French were alarmed by these activities of these Virginians because they believed the territory which they were trying to claim and divide had already been claimed by France. So they were dealing with disputed land. And when these wealthy Virginians showed up with this large land grant from the King of England, the French were looking at it like, whoa, wait a minute. We already claimed this land. So we have a disputed area. Okay? And you can see it on that map I gave you today in that area that's colored both blue and red. Well, because they did not want the English in this area, the French began constructing a chain of forts in 1753. Kylie?
Okay, this is probably a silly question.
There's no such thing.
So, how was it their to give? How was it the king's land to give? They just like wrote up a document and were like, I'll give you this. And then
But they didn't even...
The king was claiming that land because he didn't think the French did, yeah?
Also, like, I don't know, it kind of goes along with it. Like, how do they communicate so fast? Or do they not? Like, does it
Well, they
take
don't,
forever?
that's the problem, because the French are over there, they've sent explorers thinking they have it, and then the English just give out charters because they
But
think
even
they
like-
have it.
Like,
And-
even
yeah.
getting the charter, that must take, like, forever to get
So
back over the ship. Like,
So if you
You know?
sent an explorer to a piece of land that you thought wasn't explored, then you just claim that
Right,
territory?
exactly. And how's the communication in 1750? Did you get on your cell phone and call the other king and say, hey man, you claim that land over there in the Ohio River Valley, or is that for good or what? They did, that's the problem.
They didn't communicate like
No,
that.
not at all, not at all. What's gonna cause, here, it's a good,
It's
it's a good discussion. What's gonna solve the dispute? A war, you know, a conflict. They've been conflicting for 25 years all over the world over this type of stuff. Okay? So, good question. But anyway, because the British were starting to come in, these colonists, in 1753, the French began constructing forts that connected, look on your map, Lake Erie to the Ohio River. So if you look on either map, especially the first one I gave you, it's pretty easy to see Lake Erie, and it's pretty easy to see the Ohio River. So what they're doing is they're building a chain of forts. You can actually see a couple of them that we're going to talk about now. So what the French did, they began to construct a chain of forts that connected Lake Erie with the Ohio River to protect their claim from the British.
what year was this?
1753. So I'll repeat this again. The land grant that these wealthy colonists from Virginia claimed was land grant in the upper Ohio River Valley. They were going to divide the land and sell it to small farmers to make a profit. The French found out about it. They became alarmed. They believed the territory that the English were moving into, the Virginians, was not theirs. It was French land. And so because of that, to protect their area, in 1753 they began constructing a chain of forts. What's in forts? Yeah, military people to protect. And those forts connected Lake Erie with the Ohio River. Well, what do you think happened when they did that? The governor of Virginia got a little wound up. And what he did is he sent a 21-year-old surveyor to the Ohio River Valley to warn the French that they were messing with land that belonged to the British. So we got this conflict going. So when the governor of Virginia finds out about this, he sends a 21-year-old surveyor to the Ohio River Valley to tell the French, hey, listen, you got to back off here. This is British land. So, as a result of the French action of building the forts connecting Lake Erie to the Ohio River, the governor of Virginia sent a 21-year-old surveyor to the Ohio River Valley to warn the French that the land belonged to the British. What was the name of this 21-year-old surveyor? George Washington. Okay? So the 24-year-old surveyor was George Washington. Now, who really does own this? Let's get to the nitty-gritty. You guys got good questions on that. Technically, this was English land by virtue of the charter in 1609 that we talked about remember we talked about the charter, the Virginia Company of London?
Yeah.
So technically, by charter, really this was English land. So this large land grant was originated, and when you originate something, you're the first one to do it, by a charter that was granted to Virginia in 1609. So technically, or really, the land did belong to who? The British. Now, I don't think the French believed that, because when Washington came and warned them that they needed to back off, they just ignored his warning, just ignored it, and went on with business. Now, you're talking about this timeline. It doesn't take a lot of time, so just here's an example. So Washington, so anyway, here come these Virginia colonists. They're coming to, going to split this land. They get resistance. They didn't just go back the next day and tell the governor from Virginia. It took some time. And so when the governor of Virginia finds this out, he sends Washington out. And Washington tells them, and they ignore him. Well, he doesn't just walk back the next day. A year later, Washington returned to the Ohio River Valley. This time, he was a major in the Virginia militia. And that's on your ID sheet. We've got to talk about that. So a year after he gives the warning as a 21-year-old surveyor, a year later he goes back as a major in the Virginia militia, which means he is taking what with him? Say it. That's why we got to get this straight. You got the right thought. Is he taking military men? He's not taking military men. What's the definition? Who's got their book? What's the definition? Let's see. Shania, you got your book? What? Where is it?
You don't tell them that you Stroud books.
No, you don't. You don't pull the Nick Schreiber, or you end up in the bad boy rules.
See, you didn't even know when I did it.
Voluntary, I can see yours. Look up militia. Tell me what it says. Militia. M-I-L-I-T-I-A. Because the militia is not a military army.
It's like,
I want the definition of militia, and our good girl Megan's going to give it to us. He was a major in the militia. He's a ranking officer, major. But what is the Virginia? What is a militia? Civilian soldiers, or I'll give you a little better definition, citizens trained as soldiers in case of an emergency. So are they members of the U.S. Armed Forces, and do they take orders from U.S. military officers? No. That becomes an issue later in history. We'll talk about something called the Alamo, in which we have a conflict between regulars and militia. Okay, fighting for the same reason, but will not take command from the other officers. So, a year later, Washington returns as a major in the Virginia militia. And the militia are citizens trained as soldiers in case of an emergency. So they are not under any military bind, so to speak. Well, what Washington did is he took his militia and he built a fort called Fort Necessity, which is on your maps, Fort Necessity. And it was just a few miles south of French Fort Duquesne. So you can see how close they are on the map I gave you. So Washington, in response to the fact that the French will not back off, he leads his militia to the Ohio River Valley and builds Fort Necessity, just a few miles south of a pretty strong French fort called Fort Duquesne. So he's making a point. Well, what's eventually going to happen? You're going to have a fight, and that occurred on July 4th, ironically, July 4th, 1754. And Washington's militia at Fort Necessity get in a battle with a force of French and Indians at Fort Necessity. And who wins this battle?
we did.
No, we don't.
France, no.
So on July 4th, 1754, a small force of French and Indians defeated Washington and his militia at Fort Necessity. They were defeated at Fort Necessity. Okay, this is going to bring us to some, we'll see how good your thinking is. I got really good confidence that you're going to come up with this when we talk about it. But on July 4th, 1754, a small force of French and Indians defeated Washington at Fort Necessity. Well, 7 British colonies, mainly the ones located in that area, are getting nervous after Washington gets defeated. So they meet at Albany, New York. So representatives, delegates from 7 British colonies who are nervous about this French occupation near their colonies go have a big meeting in Albany, New York. And what do you think they're going to discuss, those 7 colonies are going to discuss at that meeting? Well, maybe war. I want you to think back. Now I want to make a point though. These British colonists were joined at the meeting by the Iroquois Indian Confederation, now known as the Six Nations. So, not only do these delegates from 7 British colonies meet at Albany, New York, the Iroquois Indian tribe or confederation, who call themselves now the Six Nations, meet with them. So are the Iroquois going to fight on the side of the English or the French? English. That's going to be good. So the British colonists are going to be joined in this war effort pretty soon by the Iroquois Indians, who now call themselves the Six Nations. But these delegates from 7 British colonies that are really nervous about what's going on meet in Albany, New York. First of all, who do the Iroquois hate? French and any Indians that are loyal to the French. So these Iroquois Indians are the most powerful Indian tribe in North America at the time. Very good ally for the British to have, because these guys hate the French, because the French have just pushed them. And they also hate any Indians that are loyal to the French. But here's the point of the meeting. What do you think they discussed at the meeting, other than the fact they now had some new allies to help fight in the Iroquois Indians? What does Benjamin Franklin step into history and do at this point? He tries to talk these 7 colonies into doing what?
Breaking off from Britain.
What?
Breaking away from Britain.
No? Think about maybe what somebody did in the past. Trying to talk these 7 colonies, and what's his proposal? What? To put their military together. Very good, Taylor. So Franklin proposed an intercolonial union, whereas all the British colonies would unite for military purposes or purposes of defense. Where have you heard that before? Yeah, you remember in 1643 when the English colonies began to fear Dutch expansion and Indian raids, and they got together, Massachusetts, Plymouth, Connecticut, New Haven, and they made the New England Confederation, like you said, very good. And it was a political league which gave them the ability to unite militarily, but what did it give each colony that agreed to be in it? They still ran their own government. Okay? So we had heard of something like this before, so when Benjamin Franklin throws this out that, hey, let's kind of get together and unite in a permanent union for the purpose of defending our colonies, similar to what they did in 1643, they listened to it, but in the end turned him down. Because each of the 7 colonies thought they would lose their right to act independently, militarily, if they wanted. So they couldn't get all on the same page. All 7 colonies weren't willing to let one group run all of them militarily like the New England Confederation did back in 1643. So Franklin's proposal, which was probably a good one, nobody could agree to, but they did meet. So they still have the problem. So they're going to go into battle here with the French, not unified. Okay? And that's going to lead us to our next subtopic, which is early British disasters. Okay? Because they do not unite. Early British disasters in the French and Indian War.
So would they have communicated some though, like maybe the leader of the Virginia militia and the leader?
You'd hope so, but it was a weird deal. Again, communication was easy. And you got to remember that militia are different than army forces. And a militia, a citizen trained for military matters is not going to listen to a military commander unless that commander of the militia tells them to. You see what I mean? They're different. Okay, well, a few months go by after Franklin's failed proposal. A few months go by. Because again, as you guys mentioned and pointed out, the communication doesn't happen overnight. So a few months go by, and after Franklin's failed proposal, General Edward Braddock arrived from England with a regiment of British regulars, also known as Redcoats. Okay, so they had 2 nicknames. Regulars is what you would call British Army troops, regulars. They got the nickname Redcoats not very nicely later on when the colonists get a little tired of British rule. We'll talk about that later. So a few months after Franklin's failed proposal, General Edward Braddock arrived from England with a regiment of British regulars, will later be known in history during the Revolution as Redcoats. Matter of fact, I'll give you a little side tip to history. What did Paul Revere say in his famous ride? The British are coming, the British are coming. That's not true. You know what he said? The regulars are coming, the regulars are coming. Why would he have not said the British are coming? Because they're all British. Yeah, very good. They're all British. So that's where regulars came about. So your history books in the old days a little bit wrong. He didn't go yelling the British are coming, because they were British.
They probably
He yelled,
changed the story after that.
Yeah.
Because then they weren't British.
I don't know, who knows, but anyway, now what happened is Braddock, General Braddock and his regulars combined up with Washington's Virginia militia, and they headed through the wilderness toward Fort Duquesne. This is after Washington had been defeated at Fort Necessity. So after the arrival of General Edward Braddock from England with his regiment of British regulars, these regulars and the Virginia militia under Washington advanced through the wilderness toward Fort Duquesne. Now, there's rules in war, and the rules, the honorable thing to do is the British regulars marched in straight lines and marched through the wilderness. Well, guess what? The French didn't decide to march like that. They ambushed Braddock and his troops and the Virginia militia before they got to Fort Duquesne. But I want you to picture this. Do you think the Virginia militia was walking and marching in straight lines with the regulars? No, that's not their game. So they're providing support in the background, but they're not marching with these guys. So these regulars are marching with General Braddock through the wilderness towards Fort Duquesne. They are ambushed by the French just short of the arrival there, and Braddock and more than half of his officers were killed, just like that. So Braddock and more than half of his officers were killed as they marched towards Fort Duquesne. Braddock and more than half of his officers were killed. What's that leave him have? He still has soldiers, right? He and half of his officers were killed. Well, he also lost half of his soldiers